As I mentioned at the beginning of the service, over these last several weeks, we have been tackling some of the challenging faith issues, some of those tough Bible stories that tend to trip people up when it comes to their faith. These are issues, these are stories that can lead to doubt for some people, some questions that maybe they don't feel they can answer. And for some people, these faith issues, these Bible stories can even cause a crisis of faith, leading to an abandonment of their faith. And so we've been looking at some of those tough questions. How can you believe in a God who allows suffering? How can you believe in a God who sends people to hell? How can you believe in a God who destroys the entire world with a flood? And really at the heart of all of these questions is this big question. What is God like? These are really questions about the character of God. If you say God is loving, then how can he allow suffering? If you say God is good, then how can he allow people to go to hell? If you say that God is gracious, how can he destroy the entire world with a flood? Or to maybe say it another way, if God allows suffering, if God sends people to hell, if God destroyed the entire world with a flood, then how can you say God is good and gracious and loving? And those are really good questions. Those are questions that we have wrestled with over and over again, and they get us to the very, very heart of God. And so we've been trying to unwrap these questions. We've been trying to look at the character of God, and the whole purpose of this series isn't to prove to you that God exists. As former President Barack Obama once said, that's beyond my pay grade. The purpose of this series is to speak to those of you of faith, first of all, to help maybe answer some of the questions that you have, to help shore up some of those doubts that maybe you've had about these questions. And it's to speak to those of you who are wrestling with faith, and to maybe offer you a different perspective of God than maybe you've had before, so that as you're wrestling with the God of faith, you're wrestling with the true biblical God. So with that said, what I want to do today, by way of summarizing everything we said so far, is to suggest to you that Christianity can help. That Christianity can remove some of the fog that keeps us from seeing God clearly. You see, Christianity makes this bold, audacious claim that Jesus, through his life, his death, and his resurrection, came to show us the face of God, to show us the heart of God, the character of God. Jesus came to remove all the misunderstandings we have about God, and Jesus came to set the record straight. And the God that Jesus comes to clarify for us is the God of the Old Testament. Ironically, the God that many of us see as a bully, as angry, vindictive, and judgmental. But that's the God that Jesus comes to show us. And the God that Jesus shows us is a God of lavish grace and generosity, mercy, kindness, and forgiveness. So, for example, Jesus tells a story in Luke chapter 15, and he uses that story to paint a picture of God as a shepherd obsessed with finding his one lost lamb. And that shepherd will put his life in jeopardy to find that lamb, because the lamb has so much value to him, so much so that he'll leave behind the 99 to find the one that is lost. And when he finds it, at great personal sacrifice to himself, he'll carry that heavy, shaking lamb home. And once he gets it home safely, he'll call all of his friends together and throw a party because the lost lamb has been found. He follows that up with a story about a woman who lost one of her 10 coins, and she tears apart the entire house to find the one coin that is lost because it has such great value to her. And when she finds it, she takes that coin with all the others and she throws a big party for all of her friends to celebrate this coin that was lost but has now been found. And what Jesus is saying about God through these stories is that you have great value to God. And God is obsessed in the best possible way possible with you because he loves you. You're the apple of God's eye. You are the object of God's affection, and God will not rest until he has embraced you with his grace and led you home. Jesus shows us through his miracles that God heals broken bodies, that God feeds hungry people, that God forgives the unforgivable. In Luke chapter 14, he tells a story where he compares God to this rich banquet host. And this host sets up this lavish banquet for everybody, for you. And then he sends out these invitations, invites us to come to this free banquet. And he will not stop inviting us until we finally are won over by that lavish gift and we come and enjoy the feast. That's what God is like. But ultimately, Jesus says, if we want to really know what God is like, then we need to see God through the perspective of the cross of Jesus. And that's where a number of us get tripped up. Because the cross seems to undo everything that Jesus was saying about God. How can this loving God allow Jesus to die on a cross? How can a gracious God murder his own son? Why would this good God, who's angry at us for our sin, vent all of his anger onto Jesus? What kind of God is that? And how can you believe in a God like that? And yet Jesus had a very different view of the cross and what it says about God, as did the early followers of Jesus. They saw the cross not as an act of God's vengeance and anger, but as an act of God's unlimited love and grace. Paul says in Romans chapter 6 that God proves his love for you in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ died for you. The cross is the picture of that shepherd who runs to us to find us. The cross is the picture of that woman who will not rest until she finds that lost coin, until God finds you. The cross is a picture of this rich host who throws this lavish banquet for us and makes sure that we get the invitation. But it still raises the question, why did Jesus have to die? Couldn't God just outright forgive us? And that brings us to the heart of the cross and to the heart of the character of God. Because the cross shows us that God is always and is only a God who forgives. Last week we talked about the flood and how prior to the flood, Adam and Eve made a decision that unleashed chaos into the world in the form of violence and murder. They made the decision to live by their own wisdom rather than God's wisdom. That unleashed murder, that unleashed violence, and throughout the chapters leading to the story of Noah and the flood, that violence escalates in part because human beings keep meeting violence with violence, which creates more violence. And 2,000 years ago, all of that pent-up violence of humankind was vented onto Jesus. And God, rather than retaliating by meeting our violence with violence, met our violence with forgiveness. Because God knows that the only way to rescue us, the only way to free us, the only way to protect us from that downward spiral of violence is to use the power of forgiveness. The cross is God's heart on display as he forgives the violence that we heap onto Jesus. Brian Zand, the author and pastor, says it this way: Jesus didn't die on the cross to change God's mind about us. Jesus died on the cross to change our minds about God. When the world says crucify him, God says forgive them. That's the God of Jesus, a God of lavish grace, a God who loves you and can do no other, a God who is for you and will always keep that commitment, a God who always meets you with grace, love, and forgiveness, a God who enters into every area of your life to walk with you. And that God comes to you each and every day through Jesus.